Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In this video I will be talking about second order consequences for the pandemic. Now if you're just joining in, I'm doing a series of videos about second order consequences. That means trying to think about if a special event is happening or a disruption is happening, what are the consequences of that, and then what are the consequences of the consequences. So you can try to map out all possible things that might come and then plan accordingly. Now, I'm not planning anything specifically, I'm just trying to make a thought exercise to show you how to think through things. And I already did a video about social media, which was in the past. This is more of a present topic, the pandemic. And you will see here that it's actually quite big. So there's a lot to cover, so I'll get started. Now, we are living through a pandemic, of course. The first immediate things that you see is, of course, unfortunately, the deaths. There are many deaths. I think we are over 160,000 deaths last time I checked. And yeah, the immediate problem with that will be, of course, that there is a reduction in population that has an economic impact, but also a psychological impact on families. So this is the most immediate thing that people think about when they think about a pandemic, is that people die. And yeah, that sucks. That sucks for the people involved. That sucks for the people that are close to them. And that has an economic impact. Depending on how many die, the economic impact will be different. For example, if I recall correctly, during the plague, the amount of deaths were so huge that it shifted completely the dynamics between the working class and the feudal lords. So much that the working class finally had a bargaining power because they were so scarce to do the field work. So that's an interesting side note. Then we go that we have also infected people. Actually, let's go first to the long-term health effects. So this is, in this pandemic at least, that's one of the things we really don't know that well, how long-term, maybe there's nothing wrong with it, but that is a possibility, that there are long-term health effects. And yeah, that translates itself in reduced life expectancy and reduced quality of life. And we can see how that will pressure a healthcare system in the long run. So the more people get infected, the more might have long-term health effects, the more will need constant care. And if it's even if it's a privatized or a public healthcare system, that will be a big pressure that they may not be prepared to handle. So far, very basic things about the pandemic. Let's also think about now the infected people. So you get infected with that. In this pandemic, at least, some are kind of okay. Some need hospitalizations. Again, we see that could affect the stress in healthcare system. You have also increased therapeutic demands, ICUs and ventilators. This was especially true in March and April, where the big peak was happening of this pandemic. Increased PPE demands. And you can kind of extrapolate how, for example, the stress, that immediate stress of the hospitalizations, that ends up being that either you can find those extra resources or your healthcare system kind of collapses and you need to start having triage methods. Triage is when you have to decide who lives and who dies, or who gets the attention and who doesn't, because you have to prioritize who is most likely to survive if you give them the very limited resources. And when you also have demands on material goods like this, so the ICUs, that's intensive care unit, ventilators, that's to help people breathe, therapeutic, they could be pharmaceutical things, for example, and PPE, personal protective equipment, like masks, gloves, facial protection, suits. If you have too much of the demand for that, it might happen, and it has happened, that, for example, a government or a state might enact what's called a wartime, a deal or legislation where they say, okay, this factory was making cars, we need you to stop making cars right now because we have this crisis. Instead, make ventilators or make, I don't know, personal protective equipment. And that's happening throughout the world. And that's trying to just cope with the increased hospitalizations that are coming and that demand that needs. On the other hand, if you do not do that, and in some countries they either because they didn't have that much hospitalizations or they were too slow to act, what ends up happening is that you have scarcity, and that means the people become desperate and they start reusing the equipment that they have because they have nothing else. So reusing it is better than nothing, and that ends up also increasing hospitalizations later on. It increases the health risk of the people working there. Okay, let's go now to another aspect of the pandemic, which is all the whole preventative measures, lockdown, social distancing. So the first things that we saw with this was that retail mask manufacturing increases because that mask wearing is one of the item. It was one of the tools in the toolbox that you have to prevent more people from being infected. And then telecommuting, this is involved with the social distancing. So either you stay at home, but if everybody stays at home, of course, the economy doesn't work anymore. So there is possibility to work from home. So let's encourage that. And this is actually I think big. People don't realize the effect that this is going to have. So first of all, this is maybe a bad consequence from this, but if telecommuting becomes more common and more people choose telecommuting and all work is streamlined for telecommuting first, that means that suddenly everyone in the world can make your job. If your job can be made from a computer, they can do it anywhere in the world. So there's more competition. And I think that will ultimately maybe lower wages, or at least there will be more competition. It will be more stressful to survive in that work environment. It's also true that it's hard to learn from your coworkers if you don't see how they work and how they approach a situation and how they solve the problems. I mean, they might try to explain it to you, but sometimes just seeing it, it's much more intuitive for you to learn. Also, sometimes in certain jobs, you have this spontaneity where you can randomly go chat with a coworker and exchange ideas, and sometimes that can create new ideas and creativity, and you could lose some of that if you're all working at home, even though you are still meeting on Hangouts and Zoom and things like that. You might still miss some of that spontaneity because you have to book things in advance. So as telecommuting also becomes more common, that means people will start using streaming services also more common, and online work platforms are more common. Here are some examples of the streaming services and the online work, but this is just for this pandemic. Okay, there is also a cultural impact with the pandemic. So with this I mean that there is music, movies, documentaries, and paintings that will be done for sure because of this pandemic. Already during the pandemic, we see that people were falling back on previous movies or documentaries or even music to try to cope with it or to understand a bit what was happening and what to expect. And because of the impact that this pandemic is having, for sure it will have a very big cultural impact, and a lot of creativity will flow from it as people try to process the experience. At the same time, and this is maybe not so much cultural as it is more like a scientific impact, we will have an increased science of pandemics. I mean, we already knew how to deal with the pandemic before, for example, the Spanish flu pandemic, but that was not in a globalized context. And now we can actually know in a global society how that will affect us, and more importantly, how to find the knowledge on what works faster. So in my opinion, a lot of what prevented us from really tackling this early on is that we were waiting for high quality data to really understand what would be effective or not, instead of acting maybe just more as a caution or as a precaution and saying, okay, we don't know exactly what it does, let's assume the worst and recommend this to people. A lot of people instead, they were waiting for high quality data, and that takes time, of course, because it's high quality, and that time is something we don't have. But hopefully through this experience, we will be able to actually have better pandemic protocols at some point. Another cultural impact will be that there may be pressure to close wet markets, as currently we think that the virus originated from a wet market. That is, of course, debatable in my opinion, but maybe I'll cover that some other time. But yeah, if we believe that the virus came from wet markets, then it completely makes sense to pressure them to close or to enforce higher health and safety standards. And another thing that a lot of people noticed is that there were food shortages and other product shortages. And might still get worse, might get better, we don't know, but some people have experienced this for the first time in their life. And that it has an impact in the culture. That maybe might force people to consider keeping more food in the house than usual, just in case something unexpected happens again, because before they had never experienced it. Okay, a big one now is the economic impact, of course. First of all, we have, of course, that streaming services increase the usage and the online work also. Here, you could say this is more of a positive economic impact. Some industries have thrived from this, but I would say overwhelmingly the economic impact is negative because, first of all, travel has been completely decimated. Hotels, airplanes, ports, cruise ships, all of these are facing bankruptcies, mergers, and bailouts. Overall, I think also there will be long-term less travel. People will have second thoughts before getting on a cruise or getting on a plane or booking a trip where they have to travel around the world. And this means there might be a preference both for local experiences but also for virtual experiences, and that feeds into streaming, video games, things like that. You also see that recreational companies lose business. And here I count as recreational things like restaurants, cinemas, theaters, theme parks, clubs. So all of this big downturn, this big pressure, these bankruptcies, it will cause a recession for sure, but that's the best case scenario. Then if it's very bad a recession, we are not able to fight this properly, it might become a second Great Recession or even a second Great Depression. Hopefully we can keep it just to a recession, but all bets are on the table, really. It depends how governments will try to limit the damage that is being done here. Not because they necessarily are doing the damage, the governments, by mandating businesses to be closed, but just because people, they perceive there is a threat, so they don't want to go out. And it's perfectly natural. It's a virus after all. And here we have also very interesting impact, which is the political impact. So here I'm saying basically that there are two ways that politicians and governments could have acted and have acted. So first of all, you have the cooperation aspect, and then you have the disagreement. And I think in real life, as you will see, we actually had a mix of these. So there was some coordinated lockdown and isolation response, and there has been treatment and research information sharing. And this has helped the peer review go faster, the recommendations for treatment and isolation also go faster. So that has helped people, definitely. But unfortunately, we have also seen that there is a lot of disagreement. There has been free trade of medicine restricted between countries. There have been misinformation campaigns and cyber warfare, paid by different governments and actors. And all of this has caused an increase in polarization, especially when issues become politicized. Like, just on the top of my head, the issue of whether to wear a mask or not has now become a political topic when it should be a health topic. So all of these bad outcomes might mix and mingle with each other and cause all of these other issues, which could be that the pandemic lasts longer, and then there is an increased health and life impact and an economic impact. You might have some more radicalization as people become bitter about the way things are handled or the way information has been abused in a way. And all of this can also, of course, change voting results. So maybe the polls say something, and suddenly, because of the way things are handled, people might suddenly change the way they want to vote because of that. So this is basically the outlook, in my opinion, of how one little virus, one small chain of proteins with very small information suddenly has caused all of this, all of these things that feed on each other, sometimes reinforcing each other. Some of the effects that we will feel probably for the rest of our lives, or at least a couple of decades. So yeah, this is exciting times, interesting times, but also scary times. But I hope you took something positive or interesting, or some you got some knowledge out of this, and now you think a bit also how to think about second order consequences. How does one consequence affect another, and so forth. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.